What's going on, summoners? Welcome back to another episode of ProGuides Best Champions to Main, now on patch 11.8. As always, for this series, our challenger coaches choose strong picks with high performance, low ban rates, and ones that are unlikely to get nerfed anytime soon. So they're the most reliable picks for climbing that are worth investing your time into. We do also have a series that covers the most broken and contested picks in each role, so make sure you're subbed to the channel so that you don't miss when we upload those. Now grab some coffee, do your wrist stretches, and let's get into the video.
Starting things off in the top lane, we have KLED, with probably a different build than you're used to. You'll build into Ravenous Hydra as your first item instead of a mythic, and then after, you get your tier 2 boots. You'll then build Eclipse over the more standard Gore Drinker. This gives you way more damage, and the shield works better than Gore Drinker's heal in most 1v1 situations. When you're playing KLED, the most important thing to note is your trading revolves completely around landing your Q and then having your W ready. But since W is a fully passive ability, the enhanced auto attacks can easily go to waste on minions. With then having a 14-second cooldown at rank 1, that's a pretty big window of time where your trading is pretty weak. When your W is on cooldown, stick to trying to harass your opponent with your Q instead. And don't commit to anything even if you land it, unless you're already far enough ahead to just win with auto attacks. And here's a tip that can help you win your first trade in lane. When you reach level 3, don't put a skill point into anything right away. Sit on the skill point and wait until you can land a Q. Once you do, go in with your E and level your W as you do so. That way, you always have your W for your first scrap with the opposing laner. After lane phase, you'll want to press your lead by constantly split pushing. With KLED having both high damage and tankiness, you can easily dive most opponents under their turrets when you're sure it's a 1v1. That said, you don't always want to glue yourself to a side lane like Tryndamere or Yorick, because as long as your ult is up, you're insanely useful when grouping for Dragon or Baron. Just make sure to watch those spawn timers so that you don't use your ult before those are about to come up. Out of all the top laners, KLED feels like one of the most unique to play. He has the HP pool of a tank, does absurd high damage for his beefiness, and while his kit is really good for chasing down opponents, it's specifically designed to go in but not get out, with his E and ult only being available to go over walls when chasing opponents. He doesn't really have that generic bruiser feel. And that brings us to today's question of the day. What champion do you find truly unique? And remember, this is all about the kit and gameplay, not just the champion itself. If you've heard my previous videos, you probably know I'm a Bard main, and I think that champion is just ridiculously unique. The fact that you're encouraged to roam as a support to pick up your chimes and drop your Ws into the mid lane is just such a cool design philosophy, and also the fact that he has portals to help him get around the jungle I think is also really cool. But let me know your answers in the comments down below. Up next for the top lane, we have Cho'Gath. He became a top tier pick in preseason, and since then, he's only received incredibly minor nerfs, so he'll continue to be a pick that you can completely dominate most lanes with due to his high sustain, good trading, and even the ability to land hits on opponents from range if you can hit that Q. When it comes to tanks, you have two basic categories, the ones that offer hard engage and the ones that offer more consistent disruption. And yeah, there's champions that have both, but in Cho'Gath's case, he's definitely in the latter group. He has no gap closing ability, his knockup has a delay, making it really easily dodgeable, and other than that, he doesn't really have hard CC. All of that isn't to talk down Cho'Gath though. I mean, he is one of our picks in this video after all. It's just to say that you're gonna play things relatively slow with him. Since Cho ends up having so much HP in the later stages, you're fine to fight things front to back. Not only are you already tankier than pretty much any other tank in the game, you even help shred through your counterparts on the enemy team with your percentage-based damage on that E. As you're chipping away at the front line, you'll keep fishing for Qs on their back line. Even as dodgeable as Cho's Q is, if you catch an opponent in the middle of an animation, or they're just too focused on dealing damage instead of dodging skill shots, you will eventually be able to land one, giving you or your teammates the ability to jump in and take that target down. And one last note for Cho'Gath. Our build here is assuming that you're able to auto battle, either against your lane opponent or the enemy frontline in teamfights, with Frostfire slow allowing you to easily land your Q on effective opponents. But if the enemy team comp is range heavy, you can also go Turbo Chem Tank instead to just help you run them down. And our last top laner is a criminally underrated one in my opinion, and that's Poppy. Though she's actually becoming more popular in the jungle right now, Poppy Top is still a super strong pick that can serve as a hard counter to a lot of AD top laners, especially the ones that rely on mobility like Riven, Fiora, and Camille that she can just easily shut down with W. In lane, your trading is mechanically pretty simple, but here's a couple of tips to make sure that you're going for trades the right way. Every time your passive is about to come up, make sure that you're autoing minions to build up grasp stacks. Once the buckler is ready, most opponents will try and sit back a bit further, but just use your W to get in range and get off the auto. In the early stages of laning, if your opponent's walking up to farm the wave, feel free to go for trades with your Q and autos, but you'll basically never want to force hard on them with your E unless you can stun them against the wall. Instead, keep the trades short and focus more on bullying your opponent with shorter trades rather than looking for all-ins. Poppy's ult is one of the hardest tank ults to use correctly, but it can also be one of the most rewarding. In lane, it's pretty simple. When trading on an opponent or getting a gank from your jungler, use a quick ult tap to knock them up to help ensure a kill. Or when you're getting ganked, you can wind it up and use it to send your attackers home. But in team fights, it gets a lot more complicated. You need to know whether you should be using the quicker, easier to land knockup, or looking to send opponents back to base with the much harder to land wind up ult. And also which targets you should be aiming for when you do that. But once you get good at aiming it, you'll be able to use the latter option to turn 5v5 teamfights into easily won 5v3s as long as you send 2 opponents halfway across the map. Or you can even use it to negate fights from ever happening by knocking the enemy team's engage away. And most importantly, this can also be used when your team is doing Dragon or Baron. Just use ult to knock the enemy jungler away when the HP on the objective gets low enough, preventing a 50-50 smite fight from ever happening. Next up, for some junglers, we're starting off with Zac. Zac was already a pretty strong pick at 11.7 with an overall win rate of 50%, with that win rate going a little higher as you narrow in on the higher elos. But even with above average stats and performance, he's been buffed for 11.8, and he's definitely on our radar as one of the strongest picks in the jungle. Our challenger coaches actually think that these buffs are kind of a bad idea, since they eliminate one of Zac's only weaknesses. Most jungle champs fall into the category of early game gankers and skirmishers, or the far more farm heavy champs that need to scale up, needing either levels or items to be more useful. While Zac's ganks can be really annoying to play against, he needs a pretty decent amount of levels to get to that point. His rank 1 E range is way less likely to net you kills than once you have it maxed out. So that said, his weaker early game before this patch meant that other junglers had way more of a window to outpace him, getting their lanes further ahead or even invading him to put him more behind. But with this buff, a lot changes. W is Zac's bread and butter for dealing damage, so he'll have a much quicker and healthier clear, leaving less opportunities to punish him early. The extra damage will even make him better at fighting other junglers in those early game scuttle crab skirmishes. On top of that, they're even doubling the AP ratio on W, which is why we have Demonic Embrace, which synergizes super well with his spammable percentage-based damage. There may even be some other AP heavy builds that we can see, but only time will tell. Anyway, once you get out of the early stages, you'll want to just constantly gank. With the E's max range, you can literally jump into any lane from pretty much any angle. Use this to target immobile laners that you can easily punish for just barely overextending. And if your laners have the damage for it, you can even dive squish your opponents. And our second jungler is yet another beefy boy in Nunu. The AoE damage from his passive and E allow him to quickly clear out the multi-target camps in the jungle, while his Q gives him a ton of sustain, with a huge true damage helping to quickly dispatch the single target camps. In fact, Q gives so much healing and damage that you can easily solo Dragon right when it spawns, even if you haven't reset for items. Farming aside though, Nunu also has great gank pressure, especially against immobile opponents. The standard way to gank is to come from the river, especially if you have a Scuttle Crab speed trying to boost your snowball and roll speed. But if the river is warded, hope isn't lost. Just tell your teammate to let the other laners push the wave forward, and when they do, roll in a snowball from behind your tower as they move up to hit it. With a false sense of security from having wards in the river, this tactic is usually pretty successful, especially in the lower elos where players usually don't go for lane ganks. While Nunu is definitely super easy to use, there is a right and a wrong way to play him. To make sure that you're executing ganks and teamfights correctly, here's how it's done. First, you roll in with his W, as we've already talked about. Once you land it, start casting your E on your target. But don't just stand there autoing them. You want to move behind them as you use E. That way you can stick to them even if they try to flash away. Once your E roots them, you'll continue moving until you're fully behind them. There, you'll charge your ult. If they try to continue towards their turret, they'll end up taking a fully charged hit. But if they try to back up and go around it, your teammates are able to bring them down. Also, before I go on, I'd like to mention that we suggest Hail Blades as the more preferred jungle starter, since Blue Smite can help you stick to your opponents to land your E's root. But if you're dealing with opponents that are more likely to put up a fight than run away, Ember Knife is definitely viable as a more aggressive choice for dueling. But if you'd rather play a harder carry aimed at wiping out the entire team in fights, then Fiddle is probably the pick for you. Your general game plan is to power farm, using Fiddle's insanely fast clear speed to soak up as much XP as possible. Your pre-6 ganks are kinda lackluster, requiring opponents to be pushed pretty far up to be successful. So instead of forcing too hard, if there's no gankable lanes, just look to invade, placing effigies to get vision in bushes and reset for items. It's better to keep a consistent pace this way rather than forcing ganks that will never work, and then losing your jungle on the other side of the map, putting you further away from that level 6 spike. Once you do have your ult, everything changes. With the blink allowing you to get over any terrain on the map, you can gank any lane. With ganks being so easy to pull off, you should be using your ult as fast as you can every time that it comes off cooldown, even using it to tower dive opponents with the Fear and Silence chain, preventing your foes from flashing away or even using defensive abilities. Just make sure that your laners are diving with you so that you don't make a complete fool of yourself. And outside of lane phase, vision control is also super important. With your passive, you can provide a ton of vision denial against the enemy team, but make sure to communicate with the team that you need some extra help. Once their map is blacked out, your opponents are forced to either just concede objectives or risk walking into a potential 5-man ult. Fiddle is definitely one of the more satisfying champs to play. Hitting one of those sick 5-man ults to win a game is an instant dopamine hit, but to get to that point of the game, you have to make all the right choices early. Whether it's jungle pathing, when to take dragon, when to gank lanes, which lanes to gank, or whether you should try to invade the enemy jungle, there's a lot of crucial small decisions that you make throughout the game that determine whether you're able to carry the game later on. If you throw away too much of your game early, your team will never be able to get the vision control that they need to help you land those ults. The good news is we can help with that. At ProGuides.com, our top tier coaches are available 24/7 to help you learn everything that you need to climb the ladder. So whether you need help with those basic fundamentals, or you already have a solid foundation and you're looking for some more advanced techniques, head on over and book a session now. Now with that out of the way, let's get back to the video. Now for some mid laners, let's start things off with Vladimir. Much like we talked about earlier with Zac, Vlad's buff on this patch is really not necessary. The champ's already incredibly hard scaling carry who should be a high risk, high reward choice as a solo laner. Once he gets to the late game, he's just an unstoppable carry who has the burst to completely one-shot squishy carries, while also having super low cooldowns, giving him the constant damage and healing needed to duel even the strongest bruisers. His one weakness is supposed to be his early game. His low wave clear means that he has really no priority for his jungler, and he's not able to trade that well in most lanes. This gives the other team a window where they can actually abuse him and get a big enough lead that he's never able to scale. Now with a full second off of his Q, he has even better sustain and trading power, and once he does get strong enough to teamfight, he's even harder to bring down. His early game will still be pretty much the same. You'll want to farm up as much as you can, working your way towards your mythic and boots. While he's not a massive carry with just those, he's definitely capable of teamfighting, with his ult's damage amp helping his team bring down opponents. Even when all outer towers are down, you'll want to continue farming. Vlad is not a champion that you want to ARAM with. Basically, you'll play sorta like Kassadin, side lane to get as much gold and XP as you can, only grouping to fight at dragons. Once you reach 3 items or so, you can look to be much more involved in the fights, with your main goal being to nuke the enemy carries. To do that, charge up your E, use Ghost, then flash into the enemy backline, release your E, and then drop your ult. After that, keep spamming Q and E as they come off cooldown. Most of the time, you want to reserve W to dodge incoming CC or just huge damage threats, though it can be used preemptively against certain champions like Janet to dodge her ult. And our second mid laner is Diana. Despite being a melee champion, her high AoE damage and ability to gap close make her a super lane dominant champ that can even bully out most other ranged champions in the role. Use your Q and passive to constantly shove in the wave to get priority for your jungler. And if your laner ever steps up, don't be afraid to force a trade on them if you can land a Q. Diana's damage output is high even in the early game, so if an opponent is playing too disrespectfully, you might be able to get a cheesy level 3 kill with an all-in. If your opponent does end up respecting your damage, you can use your fast pushing to shove waves into the tower and then look to roam to other lanes, invade to put down vision, or just take a free reset. Most assassins are super reliant on snowballing in the early stages of the game, and while Diana definitely can snowball out of control, you're also fine to take a slower pace and just farm your way up to teamfights. In fact, Diana is one of the few assassins that prefers to teamfight, and can even be the one to engage with her gap closer and ult. Just bear in mind that if you're the first to the fight, you'll probably need Azonias in your build, which you can take over Lich Bane. Aside from nuking down champs, Diana is also one of the fastest tower killers in the game, so if you can make a pick on an opponent in a side lane, you'll usually be able to turn that into a tower or two, and even push the end if it's late game and your team can stall the rest of the enemies. And our last mid laner is GALIO. He's been in the S tier of mid lane for what feels like forever now, and for whatever reason, he's still not being hit with any type of nerf. Despite that, he's also not too popular of a pick, so you'll easily be able to get your hands on him in most games. And since he's all about playing with his team, there isn't a lot of pressure for you to solo carry the game. His kit itself is also mechanically very easy to use. Just shove in waves with the AoE damage from your passive and Q, and when it's time to fight, dash into opponents with E to knock them up, and then chain them with your W's taunt. Between your own burst of damage and the damage reduction from your W and Aftershock, you will always take the better end of trades as long as you can chain your CC properly. That combo works even better when you're fighting with your teammates, especially those with bursty damage that can then finish off the targets that you lock down. On top of his skirmishing strength, Galio's ultimate can have a massive impact in how fights play out. Used offensively, you can use it to jump in with a diver like Camille or Hecarim, with your ult further forcing the enemy team to scatter, and then setting up your teammates to get a kill or two. And while everybody talks about picking his ult for combos like that, it can also be a super powerful defensive tool. If the opposing team has a diver, your ult can help peel them off of your backline, and even if it's a champion that you can't peel like Olaf, the massive zone prevents any of the other divers' teammates from entering the combat zone to back them up. And if all of that isn't enough, since Galio's ult gives his W shield to all allies inside, it serves as a total counter to huge AoE magic threats like Katarina and Karthus. Now moving things down to the bot lane, our first pick is Draven. With so many of the meta AD carries being more focused on scaling, if you're looking to change things up, he's the champ to roll with. His damage is insane from level 1, and with his axes basically doubling his auto damage, he never really falls off, as long as you play him well and keep catching those axes. In lane, you'll want to always keep 2 spinning axes in your hand, constantly autoing to build up passive stacks. If your opponent walks into range to CS, W forward and hit them with an auto attack or 2. Like I said, even early game, you will do a ton of damage with just this. But even with all that damage, you don't want to force too hard too early. The reason most Draven mains tilt easily and become so toxic is because they tunnel super hard on their passive. If you try to force too hard to cash in, it can be really easy to get baited into an enemy jungle gank. Instead, play the game normally, focusing on surviving, farming, and building up stacks. Once you do pick up a component or 2, you'll start dishing out a lot more damage, but even then, remember the bot lane isn't supposed to be the AD carry show. If you have an aggressive engaged support, wait for them to land their CC on an enemy, and if you're stuck lane with a more passive support, wait for a jungle gank to set you up to cash in. While that may not be as fun or edgy, it's definitely the most consistent way to play. In teamfights, you'll use your high damage to mow opponents down as they run at you. Even assassins like Zed and Talon struggle to deal with Draven, with Shield Bow helping to survive the initial burst, and his high damage allowing him to lifesteal back up to full with just a couple of autos. Just be sure to think about what to use your E for in teamfights. While your W does give you good movement speed, you don't have true mobility from dashes or blinks. So with that in mind, when you're playing against champions like Zac or Lee Sin, you want to hold your E as a defensive cooldown rather than throwing it at the first opponent that you can. Our second AD carry is Caitlyn. While she may not be as exciting to play as Draven, there is no arguing that it's definitely easier to execute with Cait. Her high range autos let you constantly poke enemies in lane, with your Q adding onto that while also giving you a powerful wave clear. Your game plan in lane is to win by war of attrition. You will constantly chip away at the turret, eventually taking plates. At the same time, you'll look to auto your opponents when they move up to CS, with your superior range allowing you to easily bob just in and out of their tower's aggro radius while doing so. To make matters even worse, for the already bullied opposing laners, make sure to place some traps down to limit their movement. Between staying out of range of your autos, dodging your Q, and walking around your traps, your opponents will feel insanely pressured, and that's without even accounting for your support. When you pair Caitlyn with a high pressure mage like ZYRA, Lux, or Morgana, bot lane becomes an incredibly deadly game of dodgeball, where being hit by a single CC usually results in being killed from full HP. And since you're playing from 650 units away, there's never really a chance for your opponents to retaliate. Once you take your first tower, you'll want to keep up the pace, rotating to other lanes and setting up to siege those ones. While Caitlyn can definitely pump out pretty good damage in teamfights, it's often the case that you use her traps to zone off entire pathways and prevent them from even happening. When your opponents do force a fight, just kite around with your traps and make sure that you're always near a wall so that you can use your net to escape and reposition for safer fighting. And our last bot lane carry is Swain, giving a mage alternative for those of you tired of getting your finger-intensive right-clicking that goes with traditional marksmen. The biggest weakness for most mages is their early game. First, their wave clear is usually pretty bad. Once they have Chapter, they may be able to easily clear out wave after wave, but until that point, they can't match the pushing power of traditional AD carries. Second, they have weak trading. Most mages have either really good poke or burst combos, but early game, their damage is too low to keep up the consistent damage that AD carries can do. This isn't to say that these mages aren't as good as bot laners, but you won't have as much priority and you certainly won't be winning fights, at least not until later on. But Swain is not those champs. His Q gives him strong wave clear and consistent damage in trades, while his E and passive work together to give him a huge chunk of damage, especially since landing the root from E pretty much guarantees you'll land a W. On top of that, for every passive and W that you land, you heal and gain max HP. Basically, as soon as you're level 3, you can win trades as long as you take them on your terms, usually after you hit your E. This is all made much easier when paired with the right support, with the most preferred ones being Thresh, Nautilus, and Leona, because of their engage setting you up so easily to land your full combo. Once you're level 6, things get even better for you, with your ult's bonus HP and healing allowing you to sustain through pretty much whatever damage the enemy team can throw at you, all while dealing a ton of damage yourself. Once out of lane, you'll want to only ever fight 5v5 teamfights when your ult is up. Anytime it's down, just play back, clear waves, and at the most, use your W and E to help make picks. And rounding out our list with the supports, we'll start off with Janna. Regardless of the meta, Janna is always at least a solid pick, due to her flexibility and utility in teamfights. You may be thinking, well, aren't all enchanters the same? Don't they just kind of sit behind the AD carry and buff them to carry fights? Yeah, in general, that is the goal of most enchanters, but with the movement speed from her passive and W, Janna can be a lot more proactive than the others, able to make use of roam timers to get vision down in the enemy jungle, show up to help with skirmishes across the map, or even go for a gank mid lane. And yeah, a Janna gank may not sound very intimidating, but they're also incredibly unexpected, and if the mid laner is overextended enough, Janna's Tornado and Zephyr can be enough to net a kill. Roaming aside, Janna's ability to completely shut down lots of champions' engage tools makes her really good in a variety of situations. Whether it's using her Q or ult, you can interrupt jumps from champions like Lee Sin and Zac that are trying to reach your Mac line. Her ult can even knock Camille out of her ult's area to cancel the effect and save her target from an otherwise inescapable death. The one important thing for team fighting as Janna is that you have to position relatively forward when compared to other enchanters, since you need to use your Q and ult to stop enemy champions before they actually reach their targets. And before we move on to the next champ, a couple of things about the build. If you're playing in a lane where you really don't think that you can spam W to harass your opponents, feel free to go Relic Shield over Spell Thief's Edge, and also swap Scorch out for Gathering Storm for better scaling. In games where you will be roaming a ton, you can also swap Lucidity Boots out for Mobies. Next up, we have MAOKAI. MAOKAI support isn't exactly new news, so this time we're mixing things up just a bit by running Comet and Scorch for a big boost to your sapling poke. If you need to be tankier to survive all-ins against the enemy bot lane, or because you're a primary frontliner for your teamfights, of course the Aftershock page will be better. In lane, your main goal is to control bushes with your saplings, with just a single one dealing a massive chunk of damage to any enemy that gets caught by it. If you have an aggressive AD carry that can follow up on a forced engage, you can even 100 to 0 squishy AD carries and supports if they walk close to a brush but aren't quite in the sapling's aggro range. Just flash W them, get behind them, and then Q them towards the brush. The knockback and slow will allow the saplings to easily catch up. This combo with Ignite is usually enough to get most opponents low by yourself, and with just a bit of damage from your AD carry, you should be able to net a kill. But if your opponents are playing way too respectful in lane, that's also fine. Your AD carry is getting free farm, and MAOKAI support by no means falls off as the game goes on. In fact, you can argue it's almost more OP, as every time the enemy team wants to ward in their jungle or around Baron and Dragon, they risk being popped by a sapling in a bush. Even when they don't actually get hit by the sapling, the time it takes to kite each one around means that they're losing tempo, and you can replace each sapling just as fast as they clear them out. When your team is forcing a Dragon or Baron and your opponents don't have the time to kite the saplings one at a time, they're forced to trudge through them with a percentage-based damage, meaning that even the tanks take a huge chunk of damage before getting into the fight. And finishing off the list, we have ZYRA. If you're the type of player that wants to totally dominate lane, poking and bullying your opponents out over and over again, she's definitely the champ for you. ZYRA is basically the Caitlyn of supports. Her Q and E give good pushing power, allowing you to help your AD carry shove the wave into the enemy turret. Once you're there, you can summon your plants to harass your opponents as they try to farm. If you think Caitlyn's 650 auto range is tough to deal with, try ZYRA's harass. If you combine her W's cast range with her Thorn Splitter's auto range, you can use ZYRA to poke opponents down from up to 1,425 units away. And while most artillery-style champs are super vulnerable once an opponent closes the gap, ZYRA's pretty capable of fighting all-in fights too. Since you'll normally have quite a few passive seeds on the ground, you'll use your E to root your opponents, summoning Thorn Lashes to slow them as you try to escape. Even if they manage to bring you down, your plants will keep smacking away, and your AD carry is usually able to trade back a kill. These fights will go even more in your favor once you have your ult. With a knockup, huge burst of damage, and increased tankiness and DPS it gives to your plants, makes pretty much every 2v2 a fight that you should be winning, as long as your AD carry fights with you. While most lane bullies fall off, ZYRA's strengths carry over and even get stronger as the game goes on. Once you have Liandry's and Demonic Embrace, a single attack from one of your Thorn Splitters is enough to do a huge chunk of damage to an opponent from well out of their retaliation range. And in teamfights, your root, knockup, and slows provide a lot of utility, all while you dish out huge amounts of damage. So much so that it's pretty common for ZYRA to top the damage charts in most games. And before we go on, one note on your build. You should be itemizing as aggressively as you can. Your main goal is to get out your full combo and do as much damage as you can to win the fight. Whether you survive or not doesn't really matter, as long as it gets the team the W. That said, if you're playing against a champ like Zed or Talon that one-shots you before you can get that combo off, you might need to pick up a Zonius to survive long enough to participate in the fight.
Alright, so now that we're caffeinated, our wrists are warmed up, and you know some of the best champions to main on this patch, it's time to start the grind. Also, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, make sure that you sub to the channel so that you never miss out on our meta guides, and you're always in the loop of what the best picks are. Also, remember to let us know what champion you think has a really unique kit down in the comments below, and as always, can't wait to see you back in the next video, but until then, best of luck on the Rift. Stay hydrated, and I'll see you next time.